Romaine Brisbane, age 34, Phoenix, Arizona, December 2nd, 2014. Killed by police officers after his pharmaceutical pills were mistaken for a gun. Tamir Rice, age 12, Cleveland, Ohio, November 22nd, 2014. Killed by Officer Tim Lockman in a public park in broad daylight after his BB gun was mistaken for a real one. Let's talk about the 95-year-old man in Chicago killed by police officers. Or we could talk about the 7-year-old girl in Michigan asleep in her bed killed by police officers. Or how about we talk about the 23-year-old man outside of his own bachelor party shot by 5 separate police officers killed the day before his wedding. In each and every one of these cases, the victims were unarmed. And in each and every one of these cases, the police officers responsible for the death of the victims were acquitted of all charges. They were not indicted and did not have to serve any prison time. That is why I'm here today to discuss with you the need of implementing a system of independent prosecutors in cases where the police are the ones being prosecuted. This would eliminate police injustice, help us dilute the blue coat bias that is so prevalent in our society today, and would also allow us to hold these police officers accountable for their actions, in which the serve and protect model that they pledge to us isn't being upheld in our society. First, I will define what the blue coat bias is. Second, I will discuss why it is still so prevalent in our society. And lastly, I will provide my solutions, that being this independent system of prosecutors who don't work with these police officers on a day-to-day basis. But first, what is the blue coat bias? Well, according to Brian Flood in a report in the University of Illinois Chicago newspaper on January 13, 2013, the blue coat bias, otherwise known as the blue wall of silence, is this code that exists between police officers, unwritten, of course, that says that they will not report on each other's misconducts, errors, or crimes, no matter how severe they may be. This was prevalent in the case of Eric Garner, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Eric Garner, a man from Staten Island, was put in a chokehold by Officer Pantaleo after Pantaleo believed that he was illegally selling cigarettes. Cigarettes that we would later find out only after Garner's death that he didn't even have in his possession. Joshua Deal reported in the New York Times on January 14, 2014, that the chokehold that Eric Garner was put in that was responsible for his death was banned by the New York City Police Department 5 years prior to the incident. Yet other officers on the scene of the crime who knew this did not step in to help Garner or stop Pantaleo. They took their line further during interrogation. When they were asked, why didn't you step in? They said, it's because Pantaleo didn't put him in a chokehold. They said that it was simply a headlock and that Garner could breathe easily. Well, when video evidence came out showing differently, you could hear Garner saying, I can't breathe. It was obvious that he couldn't breathe. Yet, all these officers were not indicted of any charges and they didn't serve any prison time and they were acquitted of all their charges and they were let loose. But we can return to the Garner case later. I want to now discuss the case of former Baltimore detective Joseph Crystal, who was forcefully stepped down from his position last year. Joseph Crystal was first in his class. He was first to make detective out of all the other policemen in the Baltimore Police Department during his class. And he was the son of 2 police parents. So basically, being a policeman ran through his blood and his veins. Well, unfortunately, in an interview discussed between Richard Shapiro in the New York Times on January 17, 2015, with Detective Crystal, Crystal mentioned how he was forcefully, through the police department, forced to step down. This after he would ask officers to go on a ride along with him and they would refuse, or when he would call for backup and nobody would show up, or when dead rats were placed on his wife and his children's front porch and on the hood of his car, or when he would receive death threats from other police officers saying that if he showed up to work the next day while following through with this report against other officers who weren't really doing their job correctly, then it would be the last thing he did as a Baltimore police detective. Now, you may be asking, what was this report that he filed against other police officers? Well, it was a report that stated that 2 other police officers who he witnessed beat a handcuffed victim until both of his ankles were shattered. Now, this shows you how there are certain instances where the policemen and women can hide behind their badges and act like it's a barrier between them and the law. This allows certain police officers to behave like inappropriate frat boys at a party school, as opposed to the justice upholding and law-abiding citizens that they are supposed to be. Now, the good man in this situation, Detective Crystal, was forced to step down. Detective Crystal, the man who had policemen in his veins and who was raised as a policeman, was the one who was labeled the rat. This just shows you how the blue coat bias is having a serious issue in our justice system today. Now, you may be asking yourself, how is it that the blue coat bias is still relevant in 2015? Well, it's because police brutality is systematic. It's not anecdotal. Bonnie Kristen talked about this in her independent journal on AmericanConservative.com back in December of last year, in which she discussed how in New Jersey alone, 99% of all police brutality cases go uninvestigated. In Chicago, between the years of 2002 and 2004, there was over 10,000 cases against police brutality against the Chicago Police Department, with only 19 of these being investigated and 0 of them resulting in any indictment. According to Kirsten, there was about 87% of police officers said that they witnessed either a crime or a misconduct that would allow, that should be result in a punishment against a police officer. Yet only 11% of them said that they stepped in and made a difference. Now, I'm going to be honest with you here. These police officers who take out these misconducts and who commit crimes are about the 1 or 2%. But it's these 1 or 2% who overshadow the population of police officers who are doing their job correctly. It's this 1 or 2% that you see in the media who are degrading our social justice system and holding us back from doing what our pillar of justice has been established on for hundreds of years. It is this 2% that is holding us back from doing the right thing. Now, let's return to the Garner case. Doug Mataconis interviewed Paul Butler, a former prosecutor himself and now a law professor at George Washington University, back in January of this year, in which Paul Butler talked about how the social justice system is a little shaky right now, and that the only reason that Eric Garner died without receiving justice was because DA Dan Donovan couldn't prosecute Pantaleo and the other officers simply because he couldn't afford it. Now, you may be asking, what do I really mean? Well, it's because Dan Donovan works with these police officers on a day-to-day basis like every other DA in the United States. He goes to them for different witness statements, for different evidence, and he requires their testimonies in court. So when he's prosecuting other people who aren't police officers, then he can prosecute the ones who are committing the crime. But when it comes time to prosecute police officers like Pantaleo, it becomes difficult because he knows if he was to prosecute them, he would lose all this evidence and these witness statements and these testimonies in future cases because he would be labeled as the enemy, just like how Detective Crystal was. So the man who was supposed to be doing his job correctly can't do that because of this blue code bias. This shows how the blue code bias isn't only prevalent in the police department, it's prevalent in our prosecutor system as well. So how do we fix this? This is where the independent system of prosecutors comes along. The system of prosecutors who don't work with these policemen day in and day out and who do not rely on them 24/7 to get their job done. Now, according to Joshua Deal, again, back looking at his New York Times article from January, we can see that yes, it will cost money to do this, but it will be worth it in the end. We can just look at the case of Mayor in Chicago, Mayor Daley, who last year had an independent prosecutor brought in. According to John Lewis in an article from the Bloomberg Review, November 22nd, 2014, it cost about $1 million of Cook County taxpayer money to pay for this independent prosecutor to be brought in to the system so that they wouldn't have any bias brought into the court system, which is how it should be. But if an independent prosecutor system had already been established, it would have only cost about $100,000. So yes, it will cost money, but it is worth the justice. Our American society has been based on the pillar of justice for over 200 years. But now we are degrading this simply because 1 or 2% of policemen and women think that they can hide behind the law. And it's time that we eliminate this bias out of the courtroom and bring justice back in. So now that we can bring it full circle, we realize that money isn't really the issue in this situation. It's that 1 or 2% who are fighting to keep the prosecuting system the way it is. They believe it would make them look bad if a new prosecuting system would be brought in. But if they were doing their job correctly, if they weren't misconducting in any situation, weren't committing any crimes, then they wouldn't have to worry about being indicted of these crimes. It's the detectives like Joseph Crystal. It's DA Donovan doing his job correctly that pushes our community forward. It's justice that we are based on in this society. And if justice continues to grade and the pillar continues to fall, then bias will fill the courtroom, not justice like it's supposed to be. Thank you.